Hello, hello, hello. Well, welcome to the selfie stick tour of Younger Lagoon Reserve. We are focusing on some habitat types in this little video. So we're going to be cruising around to maybe all of the habitat types that we have here. Starting in our original part of the reserve, the 25-acre lagoon area. This was conserved back in the 70s. This is all part of the history video. But we're back here. It's on the western edge of the reserve, and it's the most untouched. So a lot of this habitat hasn't been farmed. We've done a lot of restoration work, but this was a while back. So for the most part, not a lot happens in this area anymore in terms of restoration. So first off, we're gonna just kind of explore the lagoon area, the back lagoon, freshwater habitats, that kind of stuff. And then we'll move up onto the terrace. Before that, we'll hit the beach, then back onto the terrace, and wrap it up there. So enjoy this little exploration. So just to start this off, we are up in the eastern arm of Younger Lagoon. So what we're seeing right here, this water area, some egrets back there, and all this pickleweed, that dark green stuff that we're looking at, greenish red, that's kind of the end of the brackish lagoon. We'll jump into another section that'll talk more about that. But you can see there's some changes in the flora as we move up and out of that brackish lagoon. So moves from that pickleweed into where these cattails are and these tules. That cattail is a species of typha. And those tules are a type of species of Schonoplectus. I think that's Schonoplectus californicus. But big changes as you move out of that pickleweed over there and into more of these wet, like kind of freshwater wetland plants, right? So these are more of what you see in ponds, that kind of thing. So we're seeing a real change in a lot of for the most part, I think, like water chemistry. So we're going from this more salty area, the lagoon, into more of this freshwater influence. And then as we move even further, then we get into this willow thicket that kind of dominates the rest of the channel that kind of feeds the lagoon system. So moving down into the back of this lagoon area, we start moving out of where I was just earlier, was dominated by a lot of scrub species, and then we start getting out of that. So we start moving into our willows here. This is Salix laziolepis, arroyo willow. Start getting into some of these nettles in here. I hope you guys know what stinging nettle is. If you don't, someday you'll find out. They have these little tiny hairs on them that have formic acid in them. So they're basically these little hypodermic needles, and yeah, they get on your skin and you start going kind of numb. It's a little strange, but not that harmful. Anyways, this is Urtica dioica. We've got interesting things here. California rose, Rosa californica, some non-native mustards, brassica species. Yeah. Ooh, just got some nettle on my leg because I'm wearing shorts. Oh, yeah, okay. Anyways, so we're down here. This is the Schonoplectus, this bulrush that I was talking about. So these are real freshwater wetland species. And down below, this is something called water parsley. So it kind of looks like that. It's in the carrot family, Apiaceae, and it kind of looks like a carrot top. Anyway, so this is another one of those freshwater wetland species. Something that's similar that's also down here, one of our non-native exotics. This guy, at some point, is going to have a big stalk on it. This is Conium maculatum, and commonly known as poison hemlock, also in the carrot family, so really similar leaves. But these are the dominant plant species down in this freshwater wetland area. And then it moves into our willow thicket. So we cruise back here a little bit. It's kind of an interesting little area. So this is our friend poison oak, Toxicodendron diversilobum, and all these stalks here that we're seeing, that's all that Conium maculatum, what we call poison hemlock. So that's last year's stuff. And in terms of management, we try to manage this hemlock when it's in a patch of poison oak and stinging nettle. It's hard to get in there, like all this is. But we try and pull this stuff, and if we can't pull it, then we'll chop it down. It's actually kind of it's not an annual and it's not a perennial species, it's kind of a biennial, so it can last a couple years. So if you just chop it, it'll grow right back the next year from its rootstock. So not the best way to manage it. But it is growing in. This is a trail that doesn't get used that much, but yeah, we're gonna have our work cut out for us. So anyways, this willow thicket, we're gonna jump right into that. So heading down into the willows here, pretty overgrown, bunch of hemlock, all this salix, our arroyo willow, and then we've got all sorts of some cool stuff down here. So this is, you guys know this one. Oh man, it is bright. Down a little lower. So growing up in here, this is all our California blackberry. So this is our native blackberry, Rubus ursinus. We have another species of blackberry here, Himalayan blackberry, not a native. That's Rubus armeniacus. But the native does really well and is all over the place. They have a lot smaller spines on the stem. So these spines, like little guys, versus that Himalayan blackberry has some massive, like rose-like spines. Those are in the rose family. So, that's why they have those spines and those dentate leaves. Cool, so this is kind of the middle of the willow thicket down here. It's kind of a cool thing. This structure here is the support for our tall mist net. So mist netting for catching birds and banding birds. So this sends a net up really high so we can catch some birds higher up in the canopy. Shut down for now. This is the kind of the perennial stream that feeds the lagoon, and it's actually flowing. Got some rain this last week, finally. But kind of interesting in here, the diversity isn't especially high. We've got blackberry, that Rubus ursinus, California blackberry, lots of conium, that hemlock, water parsley, Onanth sarmentosa, all these willows that they're habitat for all sorts of cool birds, little wrens and gnatcatchers and yeah, anyways. So yeah, diversity isn't super high down here, but lots going on. This is, willows are constantly growing and falling over and providing new habitat and mulch for other things. Some of these urtica, dioica, the nettle, yeah, interesting habitat. It's not easy to move through this. So, large animals aren't really cruising through here that easily, but there's, I don't know if this is, there's one back there. There's wood rat middens in here, so wood rat nests, obviously tons of birds, and then tons of, frogs are in here. So Pacific chorus frog, potentially California red-legged frog, endangered species, threatened species. But it's neat down here. Tons of bird diversity, which is pretty great. So right now we're up on this kind of peninsula in between the east and the west arm of the lagoon. It's kind of a neat spot. It's pretty untouched. This was never farmed. And there's a ton of geophytes up here. Basically one species. but this guy. So with these big wavy leaves, there's poison oak growing in it, but this is Chlorogalum palmeridianum. I always get that species name weirded out. I might not have said that right, but soap plant. So this is a cool geophyte. These are actually what we're looking at right here. These guys, this is last year's stalks from the flowers that it put out. They have these little delicate white flowers, but a very cool plant that sticks around, and they're all over here. So I think that's something, if you're looking at someplace that's untouched, if you start finding bulbs in the ground, these geophytic plants, you're in luck. There's probably a decent seed bank of native species in here. So these are some of the things this year we're trying to plant in some of these geophytes, especially this Chlorogalum. It's kind of our most common thing. But man, yeah, everywhere up here. Back to it, the lagoon. The lagoon goes through major seasonal fluctuations and changes. Right now we're looking at it at kind of a median high level, I would say. But the height of the water table, or the water height of the lagoon, changes all throughout the year. So usually sometime in January, we undergo a breaching event. So there's a sandbar at the beginning, the opening of the lagoon where it meets the ocean, and that gets built up through the winter months with all the storms. As soon as we get enough rain, and there's a researcher, Ben Wasserman, he's researching stickleback, but he's been looking at just also water fluctuations in these lagoons, because it really affects the stickleback populations. He told me this, don't quote him on this or quote me on this, but about 12 inches of water on average of rainfall that we get in the lagoon breaches. So when this thing gets high enough, you can kind of see all that where it's like kind of white sand, there's not a lot of plants growing there. That was all covered in water earlier this year. So back in February, this thing was really full. Some of these big logs, that log down at the bottom there, it's a big root. That thing actually lifted and rotated this year. It's huge. And a lot of this wood that's out on the beach there, or the dunes, it's new. That's newly deposited wood. So the water levels here were really high. Once they get high enough, that sandbar that connects or disconnects the lagoon from the ocean, it will breach. And it basically just turns into a river with a standing wave at the entrance of it. And the water in this lagoon just pours out, and for the most part, it empties. That depends on tide height, ocean, what's going on in the ocean, that kind of thing, but it'll drain. And then it'll become seasonally connected to the ocean again. So then we've got all this saltwater influence coming in. And slowly, it doesn't stay connected for very long, maybe a week, maybe a couple days. And then it disconnects again and becomes its own system, and it starts filling with rainwater again. So it goes through these crazy, chemical fluctuations. So, going from super saline saltwater, ocean water chemistry to draining all the way out. And then, through the season into the summer, it fills and fills and fills again. And then it starts evaporating off again, and it becomes more concentrated. And there's a few fish that live in here and deal with those concentrations, and a ton of invertebrates as well. Aquatic invertebrates are all over this thing. Water boatmen, all sorts of species. But the two fish, there's something, they're both really small. They're basically annual species. So, they live basically a year, maybe a little longer, but not that much. First one, three-spined stickleback. That's an interesting fish, and we'll come back to that when we talk about research at the lagoon in week 9. But three-spined stickleback and the tidewater goby. So the tidewater goby is a federally state-threatened species. So we try and monitor them and their populations. So quarterly throughout the year, we will do, we'll stay in the lagoon and see what the fish populations are like. But they're dealing with these crazy fluctuations. And it's not just the animal species, not the fauna that's dealing with these fluctuations. The flora is as well. So everything right around this kind of what we call the bathtub ring. So right where kind of the scrub plants stop and the pickleweed, that Salicycornia rubra, starts. That's kind of what we call the bathtub ring. And any plants below the bathtub ring, they are dealing with being underwater part of the year, being out of the water part of the year, being in super salt water part of the year, being, dealing with the Mediterranean, summer droughts that go on. That's just like the normal Mediterranean climate type stuff. And then there's like right on the ring is a whole nother group. So we've got that water parsley growing, Onanthe sarmentosa. Yeah, so interesting system.
So here I am looking down at the beach from the side in the scrub, and this is a really good vantage point that not a lot of people get to see. There's again the sandbar and the lagoon over there, and then the whole beach, and this stack, which actually used to be a series of bridges, similar to natural bridges, the beach right east of us. And in the 70s or 80s, I can't remember, a big storm came and it knocked that stack over. So this is what's left of those tunnels. And so it's a cool little feature of our beach, and a lot of birds like to sit up there and preen themselves or dry off, or just rest. You can see our beach is pretty clean right now. Sometimes there's a lot of kelp that comes and washes up. It just depends on the season, the tides and the swell. So right now, not a ton of kelp on the beach. Right. So one really important thing about Younger Lagoon is that it does have this private beach that's only open to us, our interns, docent-led tours, researchers, and classes. This helps the beach stay pristine, and it helps protect all the native plants and animals that we have down there, and it also makes it a really good spot to do research. So we have a bunch of UCSC graduate students that do research down on the beach, and we also have classes that come down and learn field methods or just wander around and look at plant species. Sometimes we have art groups that come down, but we really are just trying to avoid it turning into a public beach, because we're afraid if that does happen, we're going to lose our vegetation and our dune structures. So every year we file a annual report to the California Coastal Commission, and it shows all of our data that we collect throughout the year during our quarterly beach monitoring. And that data shows the diversity of animals and plants we have on the beach, all the different species and how much of each species, including like what we seine in the lagoon, birds we see, the inverts that we collect on the beach, the small mammals that we trap, the large mammals that walk through the track pads, and all that. So you'll be able to see that during our quarterly beach monitoring week, but I just wanted to share that that's why we're keeping it private and just open to researchers and people who are using it for an outdoor classroom and a living laboratory. All right, here we are down at ground level on the beach. You can see the stack over there. And you can also notice there's a bunch of driftwood that's on the beach, and I think this stays here for longer because there isn't a lot of people taking them home or breaking them down or burning them. So this beach usually has a lot of driftwood, which is cool. Another thing to notice is that this beach has dunes, and dunes are kind of a disappearing habitat type in California, because most of the beaches in California are public beaches, and with public beaches comes the hordes of people that trample vegetation on the beach or pull it or lay their blankets over it. So we really love that our beach has this vegetation protected in these dunes. And the dunes are formed by the plants themselves and their root structures that are holding the sand in place while the wind blows the sand around them. So that's why these mounds are created. The main plants we have covering the dunes at our beach is a plant called beach burr. So it's this one right here. it does die off in the winter time. So you can see all the little sticks coming up. Those were last year's plants, and now all the new stuff is growing out right here. So when it's in full force, it'll be a pretty thick mat over the dune. And we have other species as well that like using the dune as its habitat, and that's we have beach morning glory, and this is called yellow sand verbena, which is blooming right now, late March, and it usually has a pretty long bloom time. And we have another species of sand verbena too on our beach. It has pinkish purple flowers. Here's more of that coastal buckwheat with all of last year's inflorescences. You can see they're all just dried and spent, but it'll start shooting out new flowers hopefully in a few months. The lagoon and the sandbar, and then right up on that cliff is the Brussels sprout farm that is still owned and being operated, and it's a conventional farm, which means that they do use pesticides and herbicides. However, we don't see much of an impact in the lagoon, which is good. We don't have too many non-native species down on the beach, which is great. A few that we do have include sea rocket, which if I see any, I'll point it out to you. We have purple ragwort, which is right over here. It kind of looks like beach burr and lizard tail, but it's a little thicker and shinier and greener. And then when it flowers, it has crazy, vibrant purple flowers with yellow centers. But we can just pull that because we don't want it in the middle of our buckwheat. Here's some more Dudleya. And then something cool about the beach is that we have a ton of California poppies, which are a state flower right here. And they're already blooming. And we have a bunch more popping up all over the place. Alright, so I'm standing near the middle of our main bluff section on the reserve, and if you don't know what bluffs are, they are basically the interface between the sea and the land, so that's the terrace up there, and they're on these cliffs, and so that's what we call the bluff zone. And as you can see over here, there's a ton of ice plant on these bluffs, and you've probably noticed that all over the California coast. Ice plant was brought in from South Africa and was planted near railroads, and I think it was also planted by the military because they thought it prevented erosion. But it turns out that ice plant is super invasive and it's actually bad for erosion. Ice plant is really, really full of water. So if I show you the inside, it's basically, and I'm sure you guys have messed around with ice plant before, but really high water content, and so it makes it really heavy. And so, and since it creates a mat, if it gets too heavy and falls off the cliff, it brings down a ton of ice plant with it, causing even more erosion than would normally happen. So when we started our restoration project at Younger Lagoon, one of our main first priorities was getting the ice plant off of the terrace because it used to extend way back there. So that first year of restoration, we removed a ton of ice plant and planted native plants like this lizard tail, yarrow, coastal sagebrush. This bush lupin, I think, just popped up here. It's not quite native to Santa Cruz County, but it is nearby. There's some coastal strawberry right there with the white flowers. And so there are a lot of native species now here. We can't really get the ice plant that's on the cliff. It would be super dangerous, and we'd have to set up like like a rigged system to get that off of there. But for the most part, everything beyond the actual cliffside is restored back into its native habitat. Something that you have to think about with plants that are on the bluff is that the conditions that they're exposed to are super windy, super salty, just harsh conditions. And so the plants that can grow on the bluff can't necessarily grow in the middle of the terrace, and vice versa. The plants that are in the grasslands and the forward patches can't necessarily survive on the cliffs, because you really have to be able to tolerate that wind and that salinity. You can probably hear the wind in my microphone right now. But yeah, and so it's just a unique habitat that Younger Lagoon has, and I'll show you a different section of the bluff later that has a few more bluff-specific species, not so much scrub species. So here is another section of bluff we have at the reserve. It's really close to our beach and the stack, but I wanted to show it to you because it's a little different habitat than the video I showed you earlier. So here's a really cool plant species called coastal buckwheat. When it is flowering, it shoots off these long stalks, and then the inflorescence is this little white and pink puffball at the end. One of my favorite plants, this one right here, is seaside daisy, and it produces these rather large purple daisy flowers with a yellow center, really pretty. And then we have our native succulent, Dahlia cespitosa. Kind of looks like a succulent you could get at the store, but it is native. And places like Big Sur and other public beach areas have problems with people poaching these succulents, taking them and selling them. So that was a problem for other places, but since our reserve is private, and this area at least is closed off to the public, we don't really have that problem, but just beware that there are people out there that do that. Dahlia cespitosa is the scientific name for these. And then this is a cool grass that is a lot of, or around most of the lagoon, and also on the bluffs here. It's called Disticulus spicata, which is salt grass, and so it's a type of grass that can live in salty conditions, which the bluff is definitely one of those spots. So those are a couple of plants here we have right on the bluffs. Super windy conditions, you can probably hear it in my microphone, but they have to be able to withstand that. So it's a lot of low growing stuff. You can see if they're too tall and wispy, they can get knocked over.
Hey guys, this is Nate from Younger Lagoon, and today I am coming at you from the transition between the bluff habitat to our grassland habitat. Grassland habitat is mainly composed of a bunch of low-growing bunch grasses. What you commonly see in California is a lot of invasive, non-native annual grasses, which means that they're just growing yearly and setting new seed. Whereas bunch grasses are a perennial grass that basically will continue to grow year after year and basically just be like a little mound. Whereas annual grasses kind of cover large swaths of area. So if you are in a habitat, definitely keep your eye out for grasses that are in mounds, because those are likely going to be native. So out here in one of the previously restored sites, this is kind of a really good example of what kind of is something we'd like to go for. This is one of our really advantageous and super good growing species, Elymus triticioides. It is rhizomatous, so it sends these roots underground and it basically just spreads out and covers big areas. It's a really good native bunch grass, and it's super good for helping to restore sites, because as you can see right here, there's a huge patch of thistle, and grasslands are honestly just such a hard type of habitat to restore because there's a huge buildup of an invasive seed bank, and it's just basically trying to compete with the weeds on our human level to try and eliminate the seed bank year after year and start replacing it and filling those niches. This is a really nice grassland restoration site from last year. On the left here, you got the Elemis triticioides, which is rhizomatous, as well as this Agrostis pallens, which is this really nice kind of brown cloud you see here. That's also a rhizomatous species, and yeah, it's super great. They are certainly doing really well in this habitat. Probably some of our favorite native bunchgrass, Deschampsia cespitosa, or tufted hairgrass. Kind of forms these cool little tufts and makes these really nice little mounds. In its habitat where we've collected seed in the past, they usually kind of form a really low growing habit, but that's mainly because they're getting predated upon by deer and other foragers. These guys are all starting to go to seed, as you can see here. Super nice inflorescence. Should be a good year for this restoration site because, yeah, not too many weeds. So in grasslands, there's a lot of small mammals, particularly in coastal prairie. As you can see right here coming through this grass, there is kind of a little thoroughfare, and that is like a highway for small rodents. They basically are creating a path through, and it's somewhat protective and defense against predatory birds. So if you guys have ever been down to the coastal biology campus, you've definitely looked out and seen this view from a different direction. But here is a really good example of what we are dealing with. As you can see down below, we have a lot of annual grasses. They can kind of be seen by like their single kind of stem. Yeah, they are pretty expansive. It's just absolutely everywhere. This is most likely Festuca perennis, or Italian wild rye. And right here we have radishes, Raphanus sativus, which are just pretty much a major problem. They just get really large and kind of outcompete a lot of the native plants we plant in our restoration sites. In the distance, where you kind of see that brown, is actually a restoration plot. There's some Elemis glaucus as well as some other wetland species. And in the distance, even where that guy is biking, there's a lot of other wetland species that are like sedges and rushes, which are kind of similar to grasses in that they don't have flowers and they're monocots, but they're not grasses. They're Cyperaceae and Juncaceae. So those are different plant families, different than grass, which is Poaceae. They're super nice, charismatic species.
All right, we're gonna stop for a quick second and talk about seasonal wetlands out on the terrace. So within all these grasslands and shrub kind of systems, we have areas that become seasonally inundated with water. So these are our seasonal wetlands. They support kind of a different group of species. And you know, these aren't like our willows and our cattails that are down in the freshwater marsh area. These species can deal with basically like seasonal drought. You know, they're living in this Mediterranean climate, and they can deal with drying out for the summer. So we're gonna tour one of our wetlands right now and talk about some of the plants that are there. Okay, so we're right across from the Coastal Biology Building, and this is actually one of our old restoration plots. This was our 2017-2018 plot, and it's just a great example of one of these freshwater wetland areas, and it actually kind of drains and is upstream from one of our main wetlands and drainages. So what we're looking at right here, this is a species of Juncus. It's a rush. So rushes are round, sedges have edges, grasses, I don't remember what the term is that. But anyways, this is Juncus mexicanus. It's a rhizomatous species. So you can see it kind of looks like it's spreading. We've got this little kind of tail over here, and it's, you know, this is, we're looking at right here, this is kind of the end of, there's one more actually. So there's a root that's stretching out here. And rhizomatous species are really, they are our friends when it comes to restoration. We'll talk a little bit more about what some of those other ones are, but Juncus mexicanus is one of them. See, move through here, and look at this stuff. So this is a type of carex, and carex is a sedge, so it has these edges. So if you were to feel the stems, they have some edges on them. And so this is carex Hartfordi, and it also does really well. Right next to it here, it's kind of darker green. Looks really similar to that Juncus mexicanus. This is Juncus patens. So not a spreading species. You can see it grows in these bunches. So this right here where I'm walking through, it's kind of in a low depression between this grassland area, open grassland, and this kind of scrub area over here. And so water, drains off of these two sites and pools in here. And we actually, weekly, we monitor these wetland sites. So right here, this is a monitoring well, goes down maybe 4 or 5 feet. And weekly we'll go and use a probe and see what the water level is in the ground. Just kind of trying to chronicle the dry down rates in these wetlands, and have that data for future use. This species right here, this is actually something that's related to coyote brush. So this is Baccharis glutinosa, Douglas's Baccharis, and it's actually one of the species that was used when these wetlands were originally being delineated. So when they were originally being they were trying to draw maps and figure out where all these wetlands were. This was a really important plant during that time. So as we get a little further, quote unquote, downstream, I'm gonna run into another wetland species. This is another species of Juncus. Grows a little bit differently. This is Juncus xiphoides, and it actually has these kind of flat blades. They're bumpy, so it kind of defies that rushes around idea. And then one last thing, the common name for this guy is the iris-leafed Juncus. All right, and now down at the end of this wetland, we've done a lot of restoration here to keep this site from eroding. So you can see there's some Juncus species in here. There's some aster, California aster, other Juncus, and this goes into a culvert and drains out to the ocean.
Grassland species are kind of a conglomerate of a bunch of different types of plants. You have grasses, you have sedges and forbs, as well as a lot of annual wildflowers. So this kind of creates this really diverse community, which is great habitat for all sorts of wildlife, including humans. Native Americans used a lot of these species for forage, such as wildflowers for seeds and their edible bulbs. But grasslands are this really diverse community and always kind of end up merging into these scrub communities, which can be seen behind me. And those are kind of like a less diverse area because you have a lot of cover, a lot of really fast growing dominating species that take a lot of energy and light. So scrub is, as you can see, largely shrubs and other larger perennial species that really kind of fill in grassland ecosystems. There is some debate over whether scrub is really like the habitat that we are trying to achieve, because scrub invades grasslands, and traditionally practiced by Native Americans, scrublands were burned and selectively managed in order to promote more grasslands and forage for mammals that can be used for hunting. As you can see here, this is right in the middle of a big scrub patch. There's a few different species that are main players in here. We have Baccharis pilearis, which is that kind of greener green color right there. Right next to it is Artemisia californica, which is the sage scrub. It smells really good, so if you see it, definitely take the time to interact with these plants because they're pretty charismatic. One interesting thing about these two species is they're both in the same family. These are Asteraceae, which means that they are in the sunflower family. Not blooming right now, but you'll see later in the season these guys kind of start to get going. Another important species in scrub habitats is Symphyotrichum chilense, which is Pacific aster. It's got a really nice kind of a purplish white flower. It spreads rhizomatously, as you can kind of see here. It's kind of coming up just all over the place. It fills in the gaps. It's a really good plant. But in scrub habitats, you also have other forb type species, like this right here, which is Senicula crassicalis. Not entirely sure on the common name, but it is in the Apiaceae, which is the carrot family, and it's a food source as well as just a really nice early spring flower. Here is that sticky monkey flower, Mimulus aurantiacus. These are two different phenotypes. Here is the regular one that you see around more often than not. Next to it is this red morph, which is just like super awesome looking. They are super nice. In a couple months you'll definitely be seeing them blooming all over 17 and throughout most of California. Here's a really nice patch of scrub that has a bunch of different representatives from our scrub community. In the front in the light green you have Areophyllum, which is a there's a nice turkey vulture up there, super nice big bird. Yeah, Areophyllum, lizard tail, super nice bright yellow flowers, and it looks great. In the front you have yarrow, and before that you have Symphyotrichum. Behind that Areophyllum and mixed in you have two different Artemisia species, the front one being Douglassiana and the one in the back being Californica, and behind that is just a huge patch of coyote brush, or Baccharis pileularis. And even behind those really tall trees are called coffeeberry, or Frangula californica. They have edible fruits that don't really taste very good, but you can roast the berries and use them as a caffeine-free coffee alternative, or roast the seeds. But yeah, they are certainly likely survivors of the agriculture that has gone on here. Thing that is pretty characteristic of these scrub communities is this kind of like continuous flow, like uninterrupted, no trails. It's usually really hard to get through scrub. One thing to keep in mind is that scrub communities can definitely take very different shapes, and that is largely dependent on how much water these areas are getting. So up here you kind of have like a fairly wet clayey soil, although it drains and it doesn't really like allow for pooling water or have constant water there. Whereas you come over here and you see all these willows, and that's like a willow scrub community, which is largely dominated by just willow species, Salix laziolepis, and that is in large part due to the fact that willows grow where there is constant water. So in these areas we have a stream that runs through from the upper terrace, and the willows just totally thrive out here. Hey, what's up guys? So I am out here in the restoration site that you guys would have been working in this year. This is a forb patch, and as you can kind of see on the left, there's a lot of grasses, so that's their grass patch. That's all Elemis. Actually, that's Deschampsia, but it is just covered in weeds right now. In front of me we have some forbs. These are kind of like the wildflowers and stuff that are going to bring a lot of diversity to our system. And then over, kind of, you can't see it, but the camera is in it right now, is our scrub section. This area is more or less what our scrub restoration area looks like. As you can see, the plants are really small. Basically, most of the areas that we are restoring are all grass invasive, and we are trying to build small sections of scrub communities to try and recreate that